So we added a loading spinner. That's nice and certainly helpful to our users. But what if things go wrong? If things go wrong, for example, when adding a product, then currently we're not doing anything. Now, here in this application, there is little that could go wrong, to be honest. I have a good internet connection here, Firebase is a stable service, errors are unlikely. But of course, in reality, errors will happen. Your users lose the internet connection, there is an error on the server, or invalid data is sent somehow. And here I can simulate an error by removing .json at the end. Firebase will not like this and will actually throw an error now. Let me demonstrate this. If I now go to manage products and I try to add a new product, a book for $12.99. This is an awesome book. If I now try to add this with my dummy image here, and I hit save, we see the spinner, and now the spinner will not go away. Simply because if we go back, we see that there is an error. There is an error thrown by Firebase or returned by Firebase, and that then is automatically caught by the HTTP package we're using and thrown as an error in our app. And the error we're getting here in the end is giving us an error message, which is quite helpful, which is actually nice and would help us fix that error, since this, of course, is an error I introduced as the developer. We see it's of type format exception. In Dart, there are different exception base classes, which are built into Dart, which describe errors that can happen. And here we're having such an error. So this request here is in the end now throwing an error, and it's bubbling up and becomes a real error in our app, which is thrown here in the debug console and crashes our app because we're not handling that error. We should handle such errors, not only because we then avoid the app crashing, but also because this, of course, is not a great user experience. Showing that spinner and not telling the user anything, that's not that great. How can you handle errors? Well, we used then here on our future to define the function, the code that should run when this future succeeds. Now, similarly, you can also define a method that should run when that fails. And you can simply add this after then here. You can add it after then because then itself returns a new future, and therefore whatever I call after that, so with a dot on the result of then, is effectively called on the future returned by then, right? So I'm calling this on that future object then returns. I could also call catch error here in front of then, and then I would also handle errors thrown by this post method, which is the method that yields this error here in the end. But if I call catch error here before I have my then block, then the logic in the then block will also execute once my logic in catch error is done. I don't want that. Instead, by adding catch error here, I can now define a function which will be called whenever an error is thrown either here or here. And if an error is thrown here while sending the post request, the then block will be skipped and we immediately reach this function here in catch error. So here in catch error, you do indeed define a function which receives the error data, the error object which was thrown, which describes the error, which here in this case, as I mentioned, is an object based on the built-in format exception class, and it contains an error message which is automatically printed here. And we can now interact with that error. For example, with print error here, I can also print that error message. And now here we could do all kinds of things with that error that we want to do. The core thing is that now our app will not crash anymore, because with this, we're already handling the error. So we're telling Dart, it's fine, I got you covered, I'm doing something on that error. And that's already an improvement, because the app does not crash technically anymore. Again, as I mentioned, the code in here in the then block will be skipped if the error is thrown inside of our post method there, which is the case for this error I added here. And therefore we make it straight to catch error. Now, of course, here we could do all kinds of error handling. For example, also send this to our custom analytics server to store this error message there and get notified about that error in one of our apps. Or just log it here, which isn't too useful because the user will not see that. So what we might want to do here is either not use catch error here at all, or simply use the throw keyword, which is built into Dart, to throw that error we're getting here again. So throw takes an error object, and we're getting an error object here, and it will now create a new error. So we're handling the error here, and now I'm creating a new one. I'm only doing this because I have catch error here, and I want to be able to add another catch error clause in another place. And that other place is the added product screen. That's, of course, the screen where we sent that request. Right here we call add product. There we handle the success case, and there we now have the problem that we have no success case, but that we have an error. So what we can do here is we can add catch error here as well, and now this will be reached because I'm throwing my error here again. Alternatively, if we would leave out catch error here altogether, we would also reach catch error here. So catch error is reached if there is an error, but only the first catch error in line will execute then, and that will then handle the error. So here we now also get that error object, and here we can now also do with it what we want. But here, of course, the great thing is we're now in the widget. So here we can now do something which the user sees to inform the user about the error. So here we could send or show a dialog with show dialog, and show dialog takes a context, and there we can use the context property, which is available everywhere in your state object or in your state class, and we're in the state class here, of course. And besides the context, show dialog also takes a builder, which is used to build this dialog. It takes a function which gets its own context generated by Flutter, and then here we typically return an alert dialog, which allows us to configure such a dialog box which is presented to the user. In that dialog box here, I'll set a title. An error occurred sounds like a fitting title. Whoops, that should be a text widget though, not just plain text. And besides the title, we also want to have a content here. And there I'll have another text widget where I say something went wrong. Though if we wanted to, instead of having our generic text here, we could also simply use the error here. Error is an object which will have a message inside of it, and it's configured. All exception classes in Dart are configured to have a toString method. That's actually a method which every object in Dart has. So every custom object has toString as well, because Dart basically gives you this object base class on which every class in Dart invisibly depends. So toString is available on every value in Dart, but toString on error objects is specifically configured to simply print a readable error message. And that's why here in our error log, for example, you see this nice message that's coming from toString being called on the error, and it then gives us the error message, which in this case Firebase gave us. Now, we could print this, but often these error messages are really technical, or you don't even want to show them to your users because they might contain confidential information. So here I'll go with something went wrong for the moment. Later in the authentication section, we'll see more fine-grained error handling in action. With that, I'm building that dialog. Now I also want to add an action to close it. For that, I add a flat button here where the child is a text widget where I say OK. And upon pressing, I just want to close this dialog. And we can close a dialog simply by calling navigator of context pop, as you learned. So we close overlays of any kind, and dialogs are such overlays with pop. And just like removing the current screen off the stack, this removes the current overlay, which is on that same stack, so to say. And here we can actually use the context we're getting here, CTX. So with that, I'm closing that. I'm showing my dialog when I get an error. The missing thing now is that I actually do want to remove the loading spinner and maybe also close the page if we are done, no matter if we got an error or not. Because even with an error, we're done loading and I want to give control back to the user. I just want to let the user know about that error. Now that let the user know part is finished here, we now also want to ensure that we reach then. And the good thing is, and that's what I mentioned earlier already, catch error catches the error, but then you see catch error actually returns a new future. So then after catch error, we'll also execute, because we're calling this on a future which is automatically created by catch error, and therefore here we're actually fine. Here we actually will trigger this code in there automatically, because since then comes after catch error, it will be triggered once that error is handled. I just want to wait until the user made his choice. And right now, we would immediately pop and actually change that state here. Instead, I want to wait until the user answered the dialog. And the good thing is that the dialog also returns a future out of the box. That's how Flutter configures that. So here we can actually return the result of show dialog, which is just that future. And that future will be resolved with the value we chose here for popping the dialog, right? That's also something we did earlier in the course. So only as soon as the user clicked the button and this is popped, this future will be resolved. Since I returned the future here in this function, that will be the future returned by catch error. And therefore this then block will only execute once this dialog was closed, so once this button was pressed and we popped the dialog. So with that, we now have an error handling logic in place, which should allow us to successfully handle that error. So now if I try this again with some dummy data here maybe, this is some test, and I add my image here. Now you see that spinner, now we get that overlay, that dialog, but if I press OK, we actually close that page still. And here we only see that shorter output instead of that crashing error message, because our app now didn't crash, and that output here is only printed because I'm printing the error here, and that prints the error message, which happens to be that. So this is how that works and how we can handle errors in Dart. A very useful tool, of course, because that helps us ensure that we provide a pleasant user experience. And with that back in product start, I'll re-add .json here, because of course here I want to make sure that we have a successful request again. Now in the off section, by the way, I will also show you a different way, or a way of throwing your own custom exceptions in case you don't have a technical error, in case Firebase doesn't report back an error with an error status code and you are still not happy with the result. In the off section, I'll have a good example for that, so there I'll also come back to this. For now, we have all the error handling in place that we need.